Okay, thank you all. So I'm going to tell you a little about me. I won't ask you all about you, although you're welcome to tell me anything you want. And I hope you'll ask any questions you want. I'm not an expert at this. My wife is an ophthalmologist. We met in medical school. She was probably one of the first retina specialists as a woman, so we've been sort of working on that for decades. Our journal has more women than men on it. That took a while to do. And ophthalmology was, we used to call it a boys' club, and fortunately it isn't, but that took a lot of work. But Susan had served on the admissions committee at Hopkins, so she would have been far better, but I'm going to steal the thunder, or maybe your group will have her sometime in the future and get a whole lot out of it. So before I start, Nikki, tell me how you got me. Okay, go ahead.
I'm currently doing research studies at Wilmer,
Got it.
Division of Cornea.
Okay.
And that's how I heard about it.
Okay, I hope it was okay. All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. What I'm going to do is really answer anything you want, but I didn't bring slides, even though I've given zillions of slides over my career, because I want to talk to you about things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about ophthalmology. So you probably had some great people talk to you about all different things. I didn't know anything about medicine when I started, let alone ophthalmology. So we'll talk about how we ended up, Susan and I, choosing ophthalmology. I'll tell you a little bit about the journal that we're working on. That's a little different. It's a little unusual, but it's all sort of fun. And then I'll tell you what I know about medical school and people applying. We've worked with medical students for a long time. So not to set my age, but I have 2 kids. They have kids already. So I went to University of Michigan back in '74. And I didn't know anything about medicine then. I'll just let you all know. We didn't have anything like this. Basically, I liked science, I liked music. That's how I ended up going there. They had a good music school, good science to do that. And someone who was a good friend of mine in a lot of my classes and ended up being my best friend, and then he was best man at my wedding, his dad was a radiologist. So I knew nothing about medicine. My dad was an antique dealer. My mom helped him in that. So that's not a lot of medical background. And he said, you know, really, if you like science, a great thing you could do with it was medicine. And I didn't quite understand that, but he was really right. And it's still true today that if you go into medicine, a really great thing about it is there's just so many different things you can do with it. So I would encourage anybody just to sort of start with that degree, because yes, you can take care of people and make them better, and that's what most people do, and they really enjoy it. And there's just lots of other stuff that you can do with it as well. So he was right then, and I think it was right now. And so I didn't know anything about medical schools. Time magazine was a big magazine at the time, and Johns Hopkins University was on the front cover sometimes. So I said, oh, I've heard of that one. That's how I ended up at Hopkins. I just didn't know anything. My family didn't know anything about it. It's really different. We went to some counselor. Michigan is as big as Maryland, so they would have some office there that you just sent your stuff in, and they sent your transcripts, and that was it. So this is far better to talk to people and learn. I mean, I learned from a good friend about it, but this is a good way. So, you know, feel free to contact me afterwards if you have other questions and things about it to know. So after undergrad, I went to medical school, and in the first year, I met Susan, just to give you an idea of how behind Hopkins was at the time in diversity, including in gender. There were 120 people in the class, there were 12 women. So that's really different. It's 55% now. You know, there should be just wherever it should be. But after we met, we decided to get married during medical school, which was a little unusual. We're still married after 40 years. So far so good, we say. And we liked everything pretty much in medicine, And so how did we end up in ophthalmology? We took all courses that we went through in medical school, had no idea that we wanted to do ophthalmology. I was saying earlier, in fact, ophthalmology turned us off a little bit because we thought that's not part of medicine. You don't take care of hearts and lungs, and people aren't in the emergency room, and it just didn't seem like something that we'd always thought of in terms of what medicine was all about, but it is. It's just a very specialized area, and it's a little unusual because it uses very specialized imaging. So a lot of our colleagues who are in medicine or surgery or pediatrics or whatever, they can't do what we do because so much of what we do depends on a lot of technology that we use as well. But that was a big appeal. So I remember that Susan and I took a long walk one day, and we're trying to decide, do we want to go into medicine, do we want to do a surgical specialty? And we liked the idea of ophthalmology for a bunch of reasons. So I'll let you think about that as you hear about all other fields. And it's just an example that no matter what you choose, you'll probably end up finding that you like it. Most people, 90%, stick with the first field they choose, but not everyone does. And then they choose another one, and usually they're happy by number two. So we liked the idea that ophthalmology involved medicine and surgery. So that was sort of the gamut of things that we were getting exposed to. The surgery was all mainly microscopic surgery, which was very new at the time. Now a lot of stuff is microsurgery, a lot of vascular surgery, a lot of neurosurgery is all under the microscope. But ophthalmology was one of the first ones where everything was done as microsurgery. So you're using these tiny little instruments that were very big under the microscope to operate. And that was sort of really appealing for no better reason. Not that we had done any, but it just seemed appealing for that. And so after we thought about that, there was another thing that was appealing about it. Susan and I thought that we wanted to do a practice and research. So it was probably that a lot of people at the medical school were doing research and practice. And that's not the way it is for most places around the country, and that's fine. I mean, a lot of the research I do is in clinical research, where we try to get community-based physicians involved in testing new treatments. And all they do is their community-based care, which is fantastic, and then we try to give them an opportunity to do some other stuff. But we wanted to work on that other stuff maybe half the time and practice half the time. And ophthalmology was a field where you could potentially do that. It didn't require you to see patients 3 days a week, operate 2 more days a week, and then just sort of catch your breath on Saturday and Sunday. Not that other fields that require that are bad, but this was one where the time was feasible. And I think because we were already married and thinking about having family or something like that, it's more real to us than maybe to a lot of our friends at the time. So we liked the fact that it involved that, come on in. I'm Neil, I'm just talking about ophthalmology a little bit. Another thing that was very appealing to us was because we wanted to do this research, there weren't a lot of people doing ophthalmology research at the time. You'll go to Wilmer now, everybody's doing research there at Hopkins. But the major causes of blindness at the time, 2 of the 4 major causes of blindness were diabetes affecting the eye, what we call diabetic retinopathy, and an aging that occurs in the retina where the retina degenerates and can scar. It's called macular degeneration. And there was almost nothing known about these. And that was appealing to us, that we wouldn't have to read a whole lot of things to understand the field. Maybe it seemed like a cop-out at the time, but it was very good because there just weren't a lot of people doing that. So that was appealing. That's not true necessarily now, on the one hand. On the other hand, I've learned there's always new stuff to do. So at the time, nobody was doing genetic transfer of viruses to replace genes that are causing retinitis pigmentosa. People are doing that now. So, I mean, there's just always new stuff going on. But that's pretty much how we chose ophthalmology. We sort of like the time and the lifestyle involved. That doesn't mean that doing neurosurgery is bad. It's really good. But it does require commitment. And if you're going to have a family or something, somebody's going to have to do more of the family than others. So we decided to do ophthalmology. And then we were down at Hopkins. We wanted to go somewhere else, so we went to Boston, up to Mass Eye and Ear. Harvard has an ophthalmology program, which is called Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary. That's just the name of the hospital there. While we were there, we got interested in retina, so that we specialized in retina. And then we were either going to work there or back here in Baltimore. And we had a job offer in both, which was a little tricky, trying to get jobs for two people at once. A lot of people weren't doing it at the time. It's very common now. My kids had to figure out how to do it, but at the time that wasn't going on. And so we came back down here just because the standard of living was a little easier than in Boston, and the schools were good that we were going to. So that's how we ended up here. And we thought this was a really big program at the time. There were 6 people doing retina at Hopkins, and we said, you know, why do we want to go to a place that's so big and be number 7 and 8? So we said, we'll go there for a couple of years and then we'll go elsewhere. It just kept getting better, so we haven't left yet. So we've been there, you know, for more than 30 years now on the faculty. But that's sort of how we got started in ophthalmology. And a couple things that I learned along the way was, number one, whatever you go into for medicine right now, it will be so different, likely in a really great way, 30 years from now. So I can say that because I've been doing it for that long or whatever. And it's the type of field that can keep adjusting to whatever's going on. As there are constraints with funding and the costs of healthcare, medicine will adjust. As there's challenges to growing populations, medicine will adjust. As there's new technologies and things to do, medicine will adjust. So we've just learned that whatever you think you're going into for it now is just fine, and it likely is going to continue to evolve. It's likely going to keep changing, usually in good ways, to do that. But we haven't looked back. Because I do only see patients, you know, like 2 days a week now and do procedures and stuff on those days because I'm very heavily involved in a lot of research now that's atypical to be practicing, you know, 40% of the time and 60% of the time doing other stuff. But on those 2 days, every day, it's very nice because people are thanking you for, you know, what you did and for what's going on. I didn't know a lot of stuff about ophthalmology. Like, there are surveys that have come out now, 2 of them were published in JAMA Ophthalmology, that showed people really care about their vision. I didn't know that when I applied to ophthalmology, so I'm just telling you that there's a lot of stuff you're not going to realize that come up later on. But well-characterized surveys in the US population across all races and ethnicities, when you ask people, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? And this was picked up, the article by the New York Times after it was published, you know, like, where do you put AIDS and chronic heart disease and going blind and going deaf and losing the ability to walk, et cetera. And going blind is right up there as one of the worst things that could happen to people. I didn't know that at the time. I know it now, that people really value their vision. People can survive without vision, but it's sure hard. It's you know, just imagine walking in here, if not only if you're vision impaired, but if you had no vision at all. You know, you have to sort of feel your way around. Other people see you and they see what you're doing, et cetera. So there are ways of getting around it. But when people start losing their vision, if you can help them and turn that around, they're really, really thankful. When we started in ophthalmology, there were very little treatments for diabetes affecting the retina. There were no treatments for macular degeneration affecting the retina. These are the 2 most common causes of blindness in the United States. And now we have ways of treating them. So again, if I had chosen a field because you could treat it, that wouldn't have worked. I mean, the same is true in oncology. When I was an intern, people that went on our bone marrow transplant unit, about, unfortunately, 70% of them died. They were learning how to do bone marrow transplants, and there were all sorts of issues that came up with infections and other problems, and people didn't realize that. Now, about 90%, 95% of the people live a long time and maybe go through a second bone marrow transplant if it's needed or something like that. So things will just rapidly change. But I would say, just in closing this first part, just to get all your questions from it, you cannot go wrong going into medicine. We'll talk about how it's competitive or not competitive or something, but you just can't go wrong. Because there's so many things you can do with it. So whatever your personality, whatever your likes, whatever your desires are, there are just so many things you can do with it that I can't imagine someone going into it and not being able to do that. But I just wanted to tell you just a tiny bit about ophthalmology so far, and I can tell you a whole lot more, but I'll just stop for a minute in case anybody had some questions that popped into their mind. And you can ask anything. I'm a pretty transparent person. Or you can be silent if you want. Had anyone ever thought, you don't count because you're doing research, how many people knew anything about ophthalmology other than going to an ophthalmologist? Yeah, what do you know about it?
Well, I don't know if you know Dr.
I do. He's a great researcher, genetic person, glaucoma person. Yep.
So I don't know, I got really obsessed with CRISPR freshman year.
Okay.
So I emailed him very excitedly, and he let me work under him for like a little bit of the summer.
Nice.
So then I learned a lot.
What'd you think?
I thought it was crazy. I thought it was cool taking like retinas out of like mice pups and just like doing things like
Even tinier than our eyes, right? Right. Anybody else? Because I knew nothing about it in college. Trust me, I didn't even know how to spell it. Has that extra? Is ophthalmology up there? Yeah. OPH, because we pronounce it ophthalmology. So, but I didn't know that. Yeah. Anyway, it's a pretty tiny field. So it's a real specialized field, but no different than others that are going on. But I'll tell you a little bit about getting into a journal. Because that's very different. So you won't hear that from other people. The way we advance things, like the way we treat things right now, are not the way we treated things 30 years ago. And it doesn't advance by somebody trying something and that they tell their friend or colleague how they did something, and then they do it, and then somebody else does it. I mean, it's a very scientific process. So in the laboratory, people will study, hypotheses of trying to identify genes that cause certain diseases or manipulate mechanisms or something like that. And you take that and you get an idea, and maybe somebody makes a new medicine that they think might stop blood vessels from abnormally leaking in the retina. So one way that people lose vision from diabetes is that having elevated sugar levels in your bloodstream damage the very small blood vessels that are in the retina lining the back wall of the eye. The retina is the part of our eye that acts like the back of a camera. It's light sensitive. It makes a picture of what we see. It sends it to the brain, and that's how we all see each other, but it's living tissue. So it has blood vessels, very specialized blood vessels that go through it, because the retina is really an outpouching of the brain. So it's these very specialized blood vessels, similar to the blood vessels in our brain. When you have these elevated blood sugar levels, it can damage the small blood vessels in your retina, just like it can damage the small blood vessels in your toes. People that have diabetes get poor circulation to their toes, among other things, or to their heart. And this poor circulation makes the blood vessels and the tissue around it put out these factors. They're called growth factors, but they don't always make things grow. They can make the blood vessels leaky. And the retina is supposed to be thin, like a dry sponge, and if the blood vessels in them leak, it sort of swells up like a sponge. And we call that edema of the retina. It happens in the center of the retina. The center of the retina is the part that you use to see people when you're looking at them, or to read any of those letters. You need the center part of your retina, which is called the macula. So we call it macular edema. So some very smart people in the laboratory figured out that macular edema might be due to these factors. And then some scientists worked on trying to create antibodies to these factors that would sort of mop up these factors. And they would inject these antibodies into the eye and see if they would mop up these factors in the retina. So these were anti-growth factor antibodies. And it worked. It mopped them up, the edema went away, and people could see better to do that. So all of those things came out of, like a laboratory. Somebody had the idea. There's lots of ideas that don't end up working. They'll make antibodies to something, they'll test it, and it does nothing at all. The research that I do involves taking things that look like they worked in the laboratory and then testing them in people. So my research is clinical trial research. I try to organize community practices, other universities, to take some new treatment, and we test it in a systematic way, and we say, is this better than the old treatment? And if it is, we want to report it so that people could either duplicate it or understand it. So what a journal does is, after somebody's figured out that something works, you have to share it with other people. And for some of our journals, they're peer-reviewed journals, like JAMA Ophthalmology. And what that means is, you don't just go out and say, I did this study, and here it is, and put it on some archive somewhere where everybody can read it. You send it to a journal that tries to organize having peers review it, edit it, critique it, try to make it better, not publish it if it's not good, if there's some scientific flaw in how it was done, to make sure it followed the scientific method of what was to be done, so that in the end, if you say it's better to give this injection to mop up these growth factors than to not give it, you want to believe it. And so peer-reviewed journals have developed as a filter. There's so much information out there. If you just Google diabetic retinopathy, you'll get gazillions of things, but you won't know necessarily what's true or what's not true. What should I do to my patient? What should I not do to my patient? And that's what journals do. So my whole life we've been doing research, and then we would submit it to a journal, and hopefully we would publish it. And then if we published it, it would be in one of these journals. And of course, then eventually somebody has to oversee the publishing of those journals. And so the editors decide what's going to get published. So I had worked on a lot of publications my whole life, and then I had tried to help some editors work on what they were deciding, and eventually the editor of JAMA decides all the specialty editors. So that editor of JAMA, his name is Howard Bachner. JAMA is one of the general medical journals, like New England Journal of Medicine is probably the most well-known. JAMA is right behind it as a very well-known one. You'll read in the mainstream media or even in social media things that come out in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine. Well, the things that come out there are things like you may have heard today. Should we eat meat or not eat meat? Is it healthy or not healthy? There's always new things coming out, and those, if they apply to almost everybody, those will be in the mainstream medical journals. If there's something on diabetic retinopathy, a pediatrician doesn't need to know those details. A neurosurgeon doesn't need to know those details. An ophthalmologist needs to know this. So there are some specialty journals. One of them from JAMA is JAMA Ophthalmology. There's JAMA Pediatrics. There's JAMA Cardiology. I had worked with JAMA Ophthalmology, helping the editor for a long time, and then they asked, did I want to be the editor? So being the editor, you can't put your stuff in. So my stuff has to get reviewed if I'm still doing research by somebody else. But you are the final filter. So I don't know everything about ophthalmology, let alone medicine. There's no way I could know everything about ophthalmology, especially by the specialists who are submitting things. So what we do with the journal is I'll reach out to, I have a cornea specialist on the board. I have a pediatric ophthalmology specialist on the board. I have a glaucoma specialist. I have a neuro-ophthalmology specialist. I have other biostatisticians who are all these specialists. And I'll reach out to them and say, who's a really good person in the nation or the world that can review this paper? If it looks like we're going to review it. About 85% we don't review because we can just read the abstract of the paper and say, It's not a high enough priority. It's not going to change practice. So we're very lucky. This is a very highly rated journal that if it's not going to change practice, we're not going to take it. But the 15% that we review out of the 5,000 submissions that we get each year, we need to know, is it really new stuff? And are there any nuances about it that we don't understand? So I have to reach out to experts to give me their opinion. Those are peer reviewers. These are peers of the people who are submitting things. They do it anonymously. And then we don't have them decide what's going on. I take responsibility for what gets out and what doesn't get out, unless it's something I recused myself because it's from Hopkins, so I'm not going to touch that stuff, or it's in an area that I'm doing research, so I have deputy editors that do stuff that I shouldn't be doing for our journal, but 85% of it I'll do, and then I have to decide what's going to go out there. And then I work with the other editors of JAMA Dermatology or JAMA Pediatrics, and we learn from each other what are the challenges, because we're responsible for putting out there something that people are going to trust. In the end, our residents in ophthalmology, our colleagues in ophthalmology will go to this and one or two other journals to decide if it should change their practice. So that's a lot of responsibility. We better do it right. Everyone's always watching. It's all very transparent. So that's how I started doing that. And I put term limits on it. So I've been doing it for about 7 years, and I'm not going to do it at year 10. If they'll still have me, they can always let me go. But if they'll still have me, then I'll identify someone else to take over, and they'll learn from me maybe at year 11, and year 12 I'll step down and back them up, and then they'll be in charge. So that's a little unusual. There aren't a lot of people doing editorships. There's lots of people working on journals and stuff. So that's very, very specific, way too early for medical school to do that. But that's what we did with the journal. Any question on journal before I get to medical school? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on single-blind versus double-blind reviews?
Single-blind and double-blind reviews. So this is an interesting thing. Okay, so let me put this into context for people. When someone sends something in to our journal, I'll just talk about how ours works, but obviously I like the way ours works because we had policies and then we evolved them to what we wanted. When someone sends something in, you could send it out. Let's say you know that Nikki and someone else is just like an expert in that field. You could send it to them and say, send me your review of this paper. But you tell them, we're going to give that review to the people who wrote it, and we're going to give them your name. And you might think, that's great. That's very transparent. And she critiques it, and you critique it, and then you have the review, and you send it to that person, and you could do that. That's that's an unmasked, and we don't like to use blinded in ophthalmology. That's an unmasked review. Every other field in medicine calls that an unblinded review. The other alternative is that I send it to the two of you. You send it back to me, and I could either just forward it verbatim, or what we do is we take their comments, we massage them, we figure out what works, what doesn't work, because they're reviewing 2 things a year. We're reviewing 30 things a week. So you get good at it when you're doing it all the time, or you learn how to say things, or how to be more polite, or how to drill down into something scientifically that needs to get done. And so we will say to the authors, here are some comments based on the reviewers. Now, we don't blind them to me. So I say, it's my responsibility. I'm saying, we would like you to revise it, and here's what we'd like you to do. Or rejecting it, you'll have to try to get it published elsewhere, but it may not have the same imprimatur that some other journals have. And I'll take full responsibility. So I'm unmasked. I was afraid I'd lose a lot of friends when I decided to do this. I haven't lost that many friends. Plenty of people still talk with me in our fields of ophthalmology around the world. But that's another way to do it. The reason I prefer to do it in a masked fashion is because, number one, I'm not masking anything. I'm not letting those reviewers decide anything. I'm making the decision, so I take full responsibility, and we have an appeals process. So if people don't like what I decided, they can appeal it, and we get about 5 appeals a year. I look at that really positively. If we get thousands of submissions a year, if we end up reviewing about 500 manuscripts that we think maybe will get published, we end up publishing 250 of them. Getting only about 5 or 7 appeals, I think it means we're probably doing okay. We're not going to get it right all the time, and sometimes we look at the appeal and go, you're right, we made a mistake, and we do that. But the reason we like to mask it is because we want to try to help that person maximally. And these are people's peers, and it's inevitable that you're going to hold back either consciously, because you go, this isn't good and I don't want them to know that I did that, or more often subconsciously. You're going to hold back and not give a complete review if you don't do that. Now, to me, if an editor doesn't edit the comments from the reviewers, that could be a problem, because sometimes people are nasty. And that's not good, and so you don't want that. And so just because they didn't sign their name to it doesn't mean that they're allowed to be nasty. But they're not making the decision, so I'm fine with that they're not making the decision so they can do that. It's not a crime. I mean, for criminal cases, you have to know who your accuser is. You can't just do it in just somebody doing that. It's a scientific process that we're trying to maximize the return to this person. So in my opinion, and I could be wrong, and there's studies that go every which way, in my opinion, it's worth keeping them masked. Inevitably, people have written to me saying, oh, I bet so-and-so did that. They're usually wrong. I don't tell them if they're right or wrong. I just say, I don't want to mess up the masking process, so I'm just not going to tell you if you're right or wrong. We have a very good computer system that hasn't broken down yet and keeps things masked. If I send something in, I can't get into the computer system on my submissions or something like that. So in general, my opinion is that it's better to keep them masked, that you get a better product for what you're trying to offer to that person, and that is an unbiased review. And the fact that the person can't sign it doesn't matter to me, because I'm going to edit them, and I tell the authors that here's my opinion based on their reviews to do that. And it's not so bad. With the scientific process, there's really set things. Here's my methods, here's the correct biostatistical way to analyze it, here's what the data were showing, and then a little bit is, this is my interpretation of it, but even that is based on what was shown. So typically the reviews are just going through that process in sort of an expert, detailed, nuanced way that they're doing that, and it shouldn't be too much opinion. We do have opinion pieces in there, so we'll invite people to write, like an expert, to write a commentary on the piece. And sometimes all people do is they read the commentary. They don't even read the scientific thing. They go, well, what did the experts say about that? Should I do it in my practice or not do it in my practice? And for commentaries, sometimes we'll just have the editors review it, because it's an opinion, and there's going to be a lot of bias by the commentator, but there shouldn't be a lot of bias by the authors who are writing a scientific paper, because it is following this sort of scientific method. So long answer short, I think it's better, and that's why we do it, to mask the reviewers, because I think the authors get a better product out of it. But not every journal does it that way. And not every journal edits the reviews. They just send the reviews verbatim back to the people too. We want to spend the time. We think it's worth it to do that for the person. Yeah?
This is a little off topic.
Go way off topic.
But it's still to do with research.
Okay.
So more and more people are using machine learning
Yeah.
in ophthalmology.
Yeah.
I was wondering what kind of exciting projects either yourself or other researchers are using in ophthalmology.
Okay. That's a good story. So here's another thing. So, right, when I started residency in 1983, there was no machine learning, certainly not deep learning, convolutional neural networking, no sort of artificial intelligence. There may have been a couple of science fiction things, on the original Star Trek series or something, but nothing Nothing like is what's going on now. So how did I know that ophthalmology would really lend itself to that? So a lot of the deep learning that's going on in artificial intelligence is interpreting images in ways that are probably better than we could do. And I just fell into it. So I was doing this research on treating retinal diseases. Retinal diseases require imaging of the retina. One thing that was appealing to us that I didn't mention was we can see our diseases. So you don't have to get imaging of the liver or the thing. You just look right in at the retina. We get additional imaging to enhance that, but we can see the diseases that are going on in the cornea or in the optic nerve or in the retina. So imaging was a big part of ophthalmology. All right, so park that aside. Hopkins has lots of divisions like the University of Maryland. So one of our divisions is the undergraduate college, right? One of the divisions is medicine. One of the divisions is the applied physics lab. The applied physics lab is a bunch of engineers who happen to be near Washington, D.C. So historically, over the decades, they got a lot of the defense contracts where they needed external engineers to figure things out. So a lot of the applied physics lab people, very high security clearance, they work on the programming of the nuclear submarines for all the nuclear missiles and stuff. I mean, the Defense Department oversees that, does that, but they don't have all the necessarily top experts in the Navy or Air Force doing that, so they'll recruit from the civilian force, and the APL gets a lot of that, the Applied Physics Lab. Well, they had all the contracts previously. I'm not telling you anything that's classified. They had all the contracts to analyze the satellite imagery of the military satellites, and because they were great at image analysis. This is back in the 90s, where you had all these satellites out there before Google's pictures were coming to everybody. They would do that. And they can't talk about a lot of the stuff that they're doing, even though they're very proud as scientists and engineers. So they were really good at analyzing some of the data from the satellites, and they told me that, yeah, they can look at the waves in an ocean. I don't know if you've ever been up in an airplane where you can see all these little tiny like white spots, which are the waves in the ocean. They said they can analyze those and say, oh, like with 96% certainty, there's a Russian nuclear submarine going through there just based on how the wave perturbation is going on. And, okay, well, that's cool. And I'm sure the Russian imagery can do it as well, but they were really good at that. And since they can't talk about it, to keep them engaged, to keep them from going off into some industry field, they try to connect them with the medical school. And so these people came, they said, all right, we're really good at this. Do you need any sort of cool imaging? And I raised my hand, not really, and I said, come on, let me show you how we look at the retina. Can you help us automate it? And I gave them some examples. I said, when you get this macular degeneration, this aging scarring of the retina, which happens to 200,000 people in the United States every year, now we can treat it. It starts with these yellow spots in the back of the eye, just some debris in the retina that 8 million people in the US have over the age of 65. There are 8 million of them with that. And they're 20/20. They don't know. They're just like looking like you and me, and they can read and they can see at distance, but they've got these spots. Well, I can't possibly look in the back of each of their eyes. We don't have enough ophthalmologists or optometrists or nurse practitioners or whatever to look in the back of their eyes. So I said, can you help us where we would get an image and you just tell us, do they have this debris or not? And then we could get it out there to do that. And so they started working with us on that. And sure enough, eventually, we published the first ability to identify who has this debris and who doesn't. And that was sort of cool. And of course, all ophthalmologists can do that. They can look in the back of the eye, but now you wouldn't have to have that. And you could have this little algorithm program, a non-proprietary, that people could use. If they have an image, they could say, you need to be monitored for this growth factor or not. Now, in the year 2005, there was a big study, a government-sponsored study from the NIH, that looked at all these images of people that we were testing treatments for macular degeneration. And they divided the debris into a little debris, more debris, very risky debris, like 9 steps. And to figure out these 9 steps, you had to grade 6 things in 6 ways by 6 different areas. It was like 6 times 6 times 6, whatever that was. You'd have to analyze things in that way And even though we could read that and understand that, and even though somebody could study a photograph and grade those 6 things by 6 things by 6 things and come up with what that risk is, nobody does that in practice. And yet it's a very precise way of knowing, not are you at risk or not, but are you at 3% risk, 12% risk, 50% risk, 65% risk? And that tells you how closely maybe to follow the person. So that was published, and not one retina person in the world used it. So then we said, can the computer do that? Of course, we taught the computer how to learn that, and it could do that. So that was great, and now, now the field has taken off, and anyone and everyone is working on deep learning ways of imaging stuff in ophthalmology to do that. I never could have told you even 15 years ago that we'd be working on that. And then people said, oh, you did all the easy stuff, and you know, now some of our faculty that have come in where that's going to be their area of research, they go, but you did the easy stuff, we can't do it. And that's nonsense. And I'll give you another example. So a year ago, these people that do the imaging with us, and we're still working with them on ways of rolling this out and doing stuff, when we did this thing about doing these 9 steps for macular degeneration, they came up to me and they said, do you want to do it backwards? And I had no idea what they were talking about. And I wouldn't expect any of you to know what they were talking about. Do I want to do it backwards? I go, what do you mean? They go, well, the way deep learning works, as some of you may know, or maybe all of you know, you give like 60,000 images to a computer, and you give the answer. So maybe it's no macular degeneration, a little bit, a little more, a little more, a little more, you know, or a lot. So those are the answers. Here are the images. And it goes through all these things where it analyzes the color and the location of the pixel changes and anything that it can do of the image that we don't even understand. And it runs it, and it says, oh, it's AMD 2. No. Oh, runs it again. It's AMD 2. No. It runs it, you know, millions and millions of times until finally it's learned like our brains learned. This is AMD 1, AMD 2, AMD 3, all these ranges. Okay, that's cool. That's going forward. Millions of pictures, tens of thousands of pictures, goes through millions of permutations and combinations. It can now grade as well as a human being to figure out what it's looking at. It may not be looking at the things you and I look at. I don't know what it's looking at, but it does that. Going backwards, you say, this is a little AMD. This is a picture of a retina with a lot of AMD. So going backwards, you tell it, that's the answer you want. Create me an image. Okay? It's through a process called GANs. If you do this stuff, it's called Generative Adversarial Networks. You've probably seen this where, I don't know if you've seen any sort of like the fake videos of Obama speaking, where he's saying nonsense, like he's saying, I just love going to Russia because they're the best, you know, people to have a democratic society in the world, okay? And he didn't say that, but they would create a video that did that. That's through generative adversarial networks. So what you do is you train a computer to go forward and say, you know, okay, when you get this image, tell us if it's AMD 1, 2, 3, or 4. So you put that computer aside, train another computer, and have it run it backwards. And you tell it, make an image. So it makes an image that looks like nonsense. And it goes to the computer that knows, and the computer says, I don't know what that is, it's nonsense. So it perturbs things. Maybe it makes something a little redder, or a little redder down here, or a little more yellow, or a little green, or orange, or whatever. And it keeps doing that, and this computer keeps saying that's nonsense, until finally it says, oh, that's level 2 macular degeneration. All right, and it runs it again. Nope, nonsense, nonsense. So this is millions and millions and millions of times. It just creates images that this adversarial network takes what this first network did until finally it's really good at making images. And so it makes synthetic retina images. So they said, we can create this. I said, all right, go to it. So they did it. And they showed me the images, and it looked like retina to me. It looked like people's retina that had no disease or a lot of disease. And so we took 300 real retina images that had been graded by humans. We put it through the computer, and the computer graded them as good as the humans, because we knew it could do that. We took 300 synthetic images, and we had it grade it. And then we had humans grade it, and they came out the same. So the humans graded these synthetic images, and the computer graded these synthetic images as well as it did that. Then I gave those 600 images to 2 retina specialists. And, I said, grade it, for what sort of macular degeneration it has. I didn't tell them that half of them were synthetic images, and they did that. Then I said, you know what? Half of those images are synthetic. They just don't exist. There's just no retina in the world that looks like all of those. And first of all, they were like shocked, and no, you're kidding me, because they didn't realize or think about that. I said, okay, forced choice. Now go through it again, and I don't want you to tell me how much disease there is. I just want you to tell me, is this a real image or a synthetic image? And they got it right like 52% of the time. So they were a little better than chance alone among the 600 images, and that's because every now and then there's something that is a little kooky that the computer did not figure out should have been thrown out, but not often. And so we created these synthetic images. Now you might say, why did we bother to publish that? Isn't that just a game or something? Why not publish it, in imaging research? We publish it in JAMA Ophthalmology, not by my decision. The reason we did that is as follows. You might, in biology here, certainly in medical school, need to learn about the retina. And the way we teach you about the retina is we show you diseases of the retina so that people can learn what's macular degeneration, what's diabetic retinopathy, what's cytomegalovirus retinitis, what's syphilis retinitis, what's choroiditis, what's, everything and anything in the world. Typically, those are from images of patients that we've taken care of, and typically we haven't turned to the patient and say, can I show your image? Now, if we're in dermatology and we're going to show some lesion on the face, you go to the patient and say, well, that's a really, difficult diagnosis for people to make. May I take your picture and may I block out your eyes or try and de-identify you in some way? And they may say yes or no, but we never did that with retina, because I could put up somebody's retina and you shouldn't know who that is. And we would have a very hard time teaching if we couldn't do that. But we're worried now. Why are we worried? The phones, the cameras are getting so good now with the Apple 10 or the Samsung Galaxy 9. The light is bright enough and the cameras have a deep enough depth of focus that you can get a picture of somebody's optic nerve. You can do it now. If you know how to set it, you have to know how to line it up. In about 2 more generations of phones, we think, so what is that, 2-3 years, the depth of field and the light will be good enough that you'll probably be able to get a picture of the center of the retina, of their macular vessels. Well, those are very unique. They're unique because they're just yours. Nobody else has the way your retina vessels develop. They don't develop the same in anybody, okay? But it's different than fingerprints in that you could lift my fingerprints from something if, I'm not paying attention in my hands here. Or you can lift my voice, or you could lift my face, from some image. You can't lift my retina. And so banks and other very high security areas, and the NSA does this already, use retina scans, not iris scans, because you could take a picture of me and blow up and get my iris scan, but are using retina scans because they're very unique, and unless you go inside that person, you can't get it. But now think about it. It's likely in 5 years from now when you go online to go to your bank and transfer money, it may just say, okay, confirm you, not with a password, but just confirm it's you with your retina vessels. That's highly likely. And if not here, then elsewhere in the world. And so we think it's highly likely that our retina vessels will be in some data bank somewhere, which means somebody could leak it somewhere, which means it could be identifying information, which means when I'm showing a picture of some terrible disease that blinded that person may not want you to know that they're blind. Maybe they're still flying their airplane and they didn't want to get in trouble. It's all up to them, but it's not necessarily our business to reveal their identity. Maybe they have some infectious disease that they just wouldn't want people to know about. And so because of that, we're getting very worried, and we're proactively preparing that imaging won't be available to teach, and maybe we better come up with synthetic retina images that are identical in disease but don't really exist to do that. And so that's why we're pursuing that a little bit. So, long answer to that.
Why they're trying to make synthetic images? I guess
That was why. We want to do it to teach. We want to do it to be able to teach, and because we fear that we may not be able to, if not here, maybe we'll go teach in the United Kingdom, and they'll declare that it's personal identifying information. So even though we could use it here, we can't use it there to teach, and it's one big world of medicine and ophthalmology, so that's why we're doing it. All right, go ahead.
I mean, like, for flying, I use it for clear.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can.
Does it do your retina or does your iris? I think it does your iris. It's not sophisticated enough yet. Don't worry, it's coming. It's coming. But, you know, I thought you were going to say when I fly that Air Force jet, you know, that I have to get into, you know, Andrews Air Force Base. Yeah. So it is used by the military right now, and by it's true. I mean, you can scan retinas, and it is used by high security right now, but not in a ubiquitous fashion. And Clear uses iris scans, you know, which are good, you know, to do that. And then when you check in now, the passport control customs borders they're not only taking your image, that they have some iris details, and they're increasing in their detail. So the last thing I'll tell you for fun, because I don't know how you want to do this, Nikki, but I'll tell you what I know about applying to medical school, which isn't a lot, okay? So it's not recent. But I'll tell you a few things. When my kids grew up, and I told you they're in their 30s now, they have kids, but when they were growing up, Susan was very involved in teaching the medical students that were interested in ophthalmology. And so they would go through like a month of, you know, some specialty after they did their basic medicine and surgery or pediatrics or psychiatry. They could do an elective of extra ophthalmology, and so she would guide the people that were interested in ophthalmology doing that. And she did that for about 20 years. And she would always have them come over our home for their sort of final presentations. And we did that for a bunch of reasons. We wanted them to see us outside of the hospital, to see that we really exist, that we have a home. We wanted them, you know, to see, well, we have to feed our kids as well, that this is all doable and feasible to do that. And so our kids grew up recognizing very quickly that there's no formula as to who got into medical school there. So, you know, I used to always tell them, oh yes, there are these people that went to this private school in Boston and went to Harvard College and got into Harvard Medical School and are working at Mass General and all that. I said, that's 5 people. That's 7 people. I said, but that's not the breadth of everybody that's there. There's the person who came from Nebraska, whose parents, you know, were you know, working at the University of Nebraska for something. Or they're the people that knew nothing about medicine like myself and were in music and decided, you know, that they wanted to do that. And everybody and anybody in between. So I will tell you, while you can look at averages, so you can look in your, you know, pre-medical whatever and see, here's the average for the group that got in. Those are averages. That's not any one individual. And so to me, I think you want to enjoy life and don't go by what the average is doing. Go by whatever you want to do and what you want to pursue in applying to this. And of course, my kids would then say, well, that's easy for you to say, you know, you got to medical school already. But I still believe it, and I believed it then, and Susan wasn't that way. She was always, you know, you have to do it this way, or that way, and we would sort of counter each other, because I always thought you should really go for, you know, the way you want to do it, and if people don't like that or want to take that, to me, so be it, you know, that you want to be happy with what you're doing. I do think, and, you know, for the ones who are seniors who are applying right now, there's not a lot of time to do this, but if you're not a senior, there's time. And even if you are a senior, you can still do this afterwards. I do think it's of value to work ideally with people in medicine for at least a short period of time. Everybody's different and everybody's alike, and there are more similarities than differences. And what you do is, by working for a month, 2, 3, you know, probably during a summer, I wouldn't give up a year of college. People do that. My kids had parents who said no lap years. That doesn't mean that's right, but we were trying to get them in and out in 4 years, but there's no set formula for that, so you do what you want to do. But I do think it's worth, for a few months, working with some people, if you can, in medicine, no matter what they're doing. Maybe it's just working with someone who's, works in the emergency room all the time, or maybe it's in a laboratory, or maybe it's an epidemiology project, which doesn't have to be in a laboratory. You can't do surgical trials with us. You can't do, invasive trials with us because you don't have the skills to do that. But there's lots of things you can do without having the skills. And if you can do that, you get exposed to somebody and you see, what an area is in detail, and that's not what you're going to do the rest of your life, but you see, I did something in hematology, and I learned at least what the rigors were of sort of the scientific process that went on in medicine, even if you weren't going to do research later on. And you see what their sort of demeanor is like, and what their lifestyle is like, and what they do in their spare time. I mean, to me, you need that. And the learning curve is really steep in terms of what you get. If you can't do that, fine. And if you're already senior and applying, you didn't do that, fine. There's no formula for that. But I do think that's worth considering if you can do it, because I think people come from every which way, and whatever you do in experiencing that, you're likely not going to do that the rest of your life. You'll likely go into something else and do that. But I would try to experience that and then talk about it. And then I always tell people falling back on the truth is the only thing you need to do if you're writing an essay or you're interviewing somebody. The internet is ubiquitous, and so everybody can read about every perfect sort of job that they do. But be yourself, and some people will like that. And some people will want some set idea that they have of themselves. That doesn't make it right. Most medical schools are trained to try to understand there's a breadth of people and a diverse group of people out there that you should do. So I think you're just far better off, is just my opinion, presenting yourself as you are and going after what you want. And if you don't get something, you're probably better off that you didn't get that, and pursuing something else. And if you don't get into medical school, that's also okay. It probably means, okay, that wasn't for you, and pursue something else. I presume most of you that apply from here, do get in. But it's also not the end of the world, because you can do other things. Neither of my kids went into medicine. One of them really liked medicine and just hated when he got to organic chemistry. It was like just so painful and so hard. And so he said, I'm not doing it. And we said, that's great. Or at least I said, that's great. His mother said, no. But at least he had half of the parents saying that's great. And, he loves it. He's in business now. He loves what he's doing. Ended up being a French and Spanish major in college, and that served him great for going, on into business and into business school afterwards, and doing private equity now in stuff. So there's no set formula. My other son loved science, but would faint at the sight of a Band-Aid. And so, we said, that's not for you, and that was fine. And then he loved engineering, and now he does like venture capital in sort of cybersecurity-ish stuff. And so there's no formula from my perspective. And I think I've dealt with a lot of people who've applied over decades, who've come from every which direction, not only here, but around the world. Because when we do clinical trial research, we work with a lot of universities all around the world, with a lot of physicians who aren't in universities all around the world. So I think it's okay. At least that's a perspective I'm coming from, but I might be wrong. I'm happy to hear from you if you disagree or feel otherwise. And whatever other people tell you, they're probably right. So I'm just giving you an opinion. Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you're still doing music.
I am, but that's so not the way I wanted to. You had these great ideas of, I'm going to keep taking lessons, and I'm going to play in the community orchestra or something like that. Then I had 2 kids. We were both working. We wanted to raise the kids. Then the kids went on to college, and we started doing other things. And then I said, okay, now I'm going to start, now I have grandkids. So I haven't gotten back to it. But I did continue to try to work. This is just my opinion. I thought the arts were getting under-supported in junior high and high schools around the country. Money's getting tight, and what are you going to do? You're going to cut out the biology class, or you're going to cut out the music class? You cut out the music class. You have no choice. So there's this school. It's also a camp during the summer. It's called Interlochen. It's in northern Michigan, and they have about 1,600. You heard of it? Or okay, because they were. Okay, I think it's a cool place. But anyway, and they have a school. I mean, I would never have given up my high school to go there, but I've supported it. So I working on it. So indirectly, I tried to support that. And then I ended up being on the board of trustees, and I was on the board of trustees for 10 years. And now I rotated off, but I still work with it. So I try to figure out how we can get anybody that wants to go to be able to go to the high school, even though I would never have given up my high school and gone away to a boarding school. I still think it's great, and we support them. And then there's a summer program, and it's all the arts. It's like musical theater. They could fill up the entire camp just with musical theater people, but they don't. So it's super competitive for that. And the kids that come out of there, out of the high school, sometimes go right onto Broadway. Like somebody that came out was the lead in Legally Blonde as it came out, and Josh Groban had gone there. I don't know if you know him, and a bunch of other. Who is the? I don't know. Cool people that I learned from. So I go there. So it had nothing to do with medicine. And I'd go to the board meeting, and one of the people on the board had gone there, and he was the drummer for Elton John's band. Now, of course, he had terrible arthritis, 20 years later, so he's just the helper to them now, or he's an administrator, because that's a whole production group. But you just learn different things from these people that I would then apply to medicine and stuff. So to me, it's worth, if you have other stuff that you like, to pursue it in some way. So I couldn't keep doing the performance or anything like that, but I worked on it in that way. So if you can do that, great. If it's just sports, great. If you like to, go for hikes, great. Anything, it's fine. And then there are some people who don't like to do anything other than their job, and that's fine by me too, if that's what they want to do. I find it easier to do my job if I'm doing other things as well. I come back refreshed. It's like a vacation, it's good, but you don't have to be that way. But that's not so much a challenge now. In college, that'll be a huge challenge to you once you have a career. It becomes a huge challenge if you have other things taking your time, like a spouse or a family. It really, all these things compete, and it's okay. Yep.
So why is it like that? Are the procedures quicker, or do you still see the same amount of patients?
Why is what like that?
Why is ophthalmology like that? Why do you have more free time?
Oh, I don't know if you have more free time. You have to make the time. So I think in any of these things, you can make the time. It is true that in some of the surgical subspecialties, let's say transplant surgeons, those can take 12 hours. You've got to get the donor kidney, and they might be alive, to get that. Or somebody just was unfortunately killed, in an auto accident where you have to quickly get in there, get that. The person's on the list. You have to bring them in. You have to do that. And you're working all day with a bunch of teams to do that. And just physically, takes all that day. Then it's a lot of intensive, post-op care or something like that. So some fields just require that, and we're constantly trying to figure out ways of tamping that down and not having it be so hard so that you don't burn out on that. But ophthalmology was not that way. It's very focused. You can see everything going on, and the diseases happen to be mainly taken care of either as outpatient surgery or just outpatient clinics. So that was appealing. But that makes them a little more competitive. It's not as competitive as dermatology. That's huge because that's also limited hours, because it's appealing. It has cosmetics to it as well, and the reimbursement is good for it. So that's good. And I was saying before, a lot of you came in. Emergency medicine is really huge now because the hours are set. You're going in at 12. You're leaving at 12. You can do a 3-day week. That might be easier to handle, other things, family or whatever. So they're all different. You learn about that, and you figure out what you want to do. Had I not met my wife in medical school, I might not have gone into ophthalmology. But we were like, okay, we're both doing this. How are we going to both fit it in? And it just depends. Like my son is in private equity, and right now he's trying to build up in that, so that just takes a ton of time. And my daughter-in-law is a lawyer, and they just decided she'll work like 6, 7 hours a day, and he's working, I don't like it, 12, 14 hours a day. But everybody figures it out differently, and there's no set way of doing it. Yeah.
Can you talk about the side effects of UV damage and also visible light to the retina?
Okay.
And additionally, can you talk about the study of where the clinical trial that was on the impact of dark chocolate?
Oh, okay. All right.
On visual acuity.
All right. Well, that's a funny one. Okay. So the impact of visible light, is that what you said, or ultraviolet light?
Visible light and also ultraviolet.
Okay. So let's go to ultraviolet light first. There's a lot of armchair theorists around, and by that I mean they sit back, they come up with some theory, and so we know that if you shine really bright light, like a microscope light, onto a retina, you can burn it. We learned that through cataract surgery, unfortunately, that if you kept the light focused too long, the retina would burn from the light. So then people said, oh, there's this common cause of degeneration of the retina, this macular degeneration. It's so common. What causes it? So people said, well, if you have this intense light and it damages the retina, I bet just sunlight must do that, or ultraviolet light must do that. So these were just theories. And they catch on like wildfire. And you can read things from the late 70s, early 80s, where you would read in Reader's Digest, warning, stay away from ultraviolet light. It can cause your retina to degenerate, without any proof, without any proof. All right, but it sounded like a great idea. So when we heard about this, it didn't make sense to us because the cornea in front of the retina and your lens absorbs like 99% of all the ultraviolet light. So no ultraviolet light gets back to the retina. So we said, that seems like nonsense, but we had to do a big population-based study where we looked at people that were exposed to a lot of ultraviolet light, people that weren't. We went out to the Chesapeake Bay. There are Chesapeake Bay watermen who are out in the sun all the time. And there are people in their towns as controls who are very little by surveys out in the sun. And they each had equal amounts of macular degeneration, where they had a lot of UV light or no UV light. The people with a lot of UV light, they had a lot more basal cell carcinomas, a lot more skin cancer, but they didn't have more macular degeneration. All right, so we put that to rest. And of course, all these people who had sat back telling us that ultraviolet light causes macular degeneration said, oh, never mind. And I go, what do you mean, never mind? You wrote all these things in these newspapers and things about it, and you scared people. No, we meant visible light. You only studied ultraviolet light. So we had to go back and look at visible light exposure on people, and there just is very little, if any, data to support that the amount of lifetime visible light exposure is related to macular degeneration. Now, that's an association. It's not a cause and effect, so I can't randomly assign people to grow up totally in darkness and totally in light and prove that the ones in light have no macular degeneration, have all the macular degeneration. But the associations in tens and tens of thousands of populations are just not there, that we're pretty convinced it's not a cause and effect as far as the light is concerned. The chocolate, I'll show you something. Can you get to the internet here?
Yeah.
And all right. Let's see. I'll tell you what she's talking about with chocolate. And then I'll tell you sort of a funny story. Okay, it's on here? Okay, let's see. See if this works. It worked. Okay, here's our journal. This week, effects of flavanol-rich dark chocolate on visual. Okay, this just came out. And what's that all about? Well, you know, I just had my editorial board meeting this week. So there you get an ad that we didn't want. Okay. So this is the article. It's a randomized trial. That's a good scientific way of figuring out if I give you dark chocolate or I don't give you dark chocolate, does your function change in some way? Now, why are we talking about this? Well, I'll just tell you, this is the exception, not the rule. That is, this is not going to change clinical practice. Okay, so 99% of what we publish will change clinical practice. The way this came about is as follows. About a year and a half ago, another group of investigators took dark chocolate and milk chocolate because the dark chocolate has this flavanol in it, which is believed to be involved in part of the light system that we use to see, because we have these rods and cones and they're constantly regenerating themselves, and there might be a role for flavanol in our diet to help the rods and cones work. Okay, so this person hypothesized, just sitting in a chair, I bet if you eat a lot of dark chocolate, which is rich in flavanol, your contrast sensitivity, your ability to see, would be better. Now, that's not going to change anything. That doesn't mean you should start eating dark chocolate all the time. But his group did a randomized trial where they gave half the people dark chocolate, half milk chocolate, and then they measured their contrast on these letters, and it was better in the ones that took the dark chocolate. Now, first of all, that could happen by chance alone. If you do studies all the time and you say, I want to be 95% certain that the result is real, that means 5% of the time you'll conclude it's real when it really isn't, based on the biostatistics that you do. So it could have been by chance, and the authors said that. They said this could be by chance, but isn't this interesting? And it caught on like wildfire. So it should be referenced here. If we go to the references in this, let's go down. See if they have it here. Sorry, this will take 1 sec. Well, I won't go through it, but it caught on like wildfire. So the views, there were like thousands of views of the article. This altmetric score tells you how much social and mainstream media are looking at it. So you can see even for this article, it's only been out less than a week, and there are these 7 news stories on it already, and people that are twittering about it, and from 17,000 followers, 1 Facebook thing about it, 3 blog posts on it. So these are all ways of looking at how this is catching on in mainstream or social media. The bottom line is, these people said, I don't believe it. We want to see if we can reproduce it. So we did publish that first one because we said, well, it was sort of interesting, and it was a little lighter hearted, and maybe 1 out of 100 articles that we will put out. As long as the science is good, we might put it out. So that's why we put out that 1 article, and I thought, I was praying that someone else would test it to either debunk it or really show that this needs to be looked at further on. And sure enough, these people in Germany did the same thing, only better. They had a better design. They looked at this optical coherence tomography angiography where they could look at flow of the blood vessels in a non-invasive way. They did it better, and they showed, the dark chocolate is no better than no dark chocolate around this, which means the first finding was likely by chance alone. And that's probably going to be the end of it. So we had to publish this. We didn't want to get the whole thing started again, but we had to publish it. So we did that. But we don't often have things that don't change practice. But this was the exception that you brought up. But also, it caught on. But how social media catches on is not important to us. What's important to us is, what articles get cited in the scientific literature. Now, nothing gets cited within the first week that it's been published by another journal. But we're very interested, when we go back, a couple years, we're very interested in, how many things are cited, because that tells us, that it's an important article. So if we go back, to issues from, past issues from 2 years ago, and we say, let's put into JAMA Ophthalmology Zika virus, Zika. So that was, as you know, endemic in Brazil and some other areas, and it was uncovered that it would cause problems not only with the skull formation, but also in the retina. So this was, finding quantitative microstructural changes of the retina in infants with congenital Zika. So that was in 2017. Just 2 years ago, and it's been cited 13 times. That's what we're looking for, and people have looked at it, 7,800 times, and that's what you want to see when you're, when you're trying to find out, are people really interested in doing this? So here they're saying, that it can do all these problems and how it can affect it, and that's really what we're looking for to do this. And then they found as many as 55% of the people might have this. So this was the first article published on it. So if we go to that article, in 2016. That's even a year earlier. See, it was cited 130 times. That's what we want to have in our journal. That means other scientists are taking this and looking at it. Yes, 113,000 people looked at it because Zika was hot, and everyone wanted to know, what can this do to a baby, or can it cause them blindness or something? But those are the sort of things that you hope, if you're a good editor and if it catches on that this is the place to go, and you've got good reviews and you've got good editing to it, people will want to send their best stuff there. So we wanted people to send us stuff like the first ocular findings in infants that had Zika virus and stuff like that. So that's what we try and do. Chocolate, Zika, yeah, two different things. All right. I don't want to keep you all, but Nikki knows where to get me, so if you have questions that I could answer, feel free to let me know. I'll try and make time to answer. I don't think I was too delayed in getting back to you there. And you're all very kind to have me, so have a great year. Good luck with your applications. These were just my opinion. That's what I was giving you, not any formal analysis of who applies or who gets in, or how it works, but I thought maybe you'd want that perspective, and so thanks a lot. Very good.